I'm particularly pleased to welcome our next two speakers. Percy and Mark worked with Albert Schweitzer at Lombrene in the early 60s. In 1963, Schweitzer blessed their engagement. Percy is the former chairman of the charity Reverence for Life UK, who will be speaking on the question of our need for the guiding principle of reverence for life.
Like most visitors, I arrived at Lombrene by being ferried across the river. And Schweitzer was standing at the landing stage with his entourage, watching me carefully step out of the rocking dugout. It was quite a tricky business. As I took his outstretched hand, his first words to me were, "Well, young man, what are your plans?" The unusual greeting took me by surprise, and I stammered, "I don't really have any plans right now." "Aha," he said, as his grip tightened on my hand and his eyes poured into mine. "A free man." At that moment, the idea of what it might be like to be free surged through my mind. Free from the urge to plan every minute of the day, free from prejudice and imposed religious beliefs, free from the fear of failure and what other people might think, free from negative emotions and identifications. I had had a flavour of what a direct contact with this man might be like. And it set me on a path along which I'm still travelling, 53 years later. My family celebrated my 80th birthday in spring of this year, and I have realized that when you're over 80 these days, you may begin to call yourself old with impunity. The average life expectancy here these days is claimed to be 79 or 81, depending on which source you believe. Now, in this time of constant acceleration and love of speed, old is associated with slowness. But as some people are beginning to realize, for certain things, slow is beautiful. As in slow food, slow cooking, slow and deep breathing, just walking slowly. I introduced this rose to help us decelerate and create a moment of stillness, so that when we embark on the substance of my talk, we can savor it slowly. Well then, our need for the guiding principle of reverence for life. And believe me, pondering this proved most rewarding, and I'm grateful for having been given this title. And I want to examine this with you under three headings. I don't think I need to read them out. I will start with where. To consider this, let us broaden the horizon, our horizon, from this space in which we are now sitting to an altogether different perception of space. One that is not enclosed by walls or any kind of boundaries. One that penetrates everything and is everywhere. One that is infinitely large, infinitely fine and still, and that cannot be cut or moved or disturbed in any way. The space within which all existence takes place. Now, scientists tell us that in this space, where else, some 13.8 billion years ago, there was a Big Bang, course, this is not an image of that actual event. It just suggests it. A singularity, whatever that may be, is said to have burst open and begun to expand very rapidly, and this resulted in billions of galaxies, including our galaxy, the Milky Way, which includes our solar system. You can see the Earth there with its little moon, which includes our Earth. I just can't resist these pictures of the world we live in. Is it not amazing that we can actually see these things? I'm always struck by how very thin the Earth's atmosphere actually is. Now, just in case anyone thinks that the awareness of Earth's fragility and vulnerability is a recent thing, let me quote Schweitzer writing about this nearly a century ago. The slightest disturbance of the now existing atmospheric conditions can bring life on Earth to an end. Should there be a deviation in the Earth's rotation around its own axis or around the Sun, or should for any reason the surface temperature vary either up or down, or should she no longer be enveloped by a gaseous protective mantle which serves as temperature regulator, then she will again be without the life which thrives on her now. Our precious Earth. There is now a consensus among quite a few scientists that the Earth is a self-regulating living entity. It has been named Gaia after the Greek goddess of the Earth. As such, it is now seen by many as part of a living solar system, in a living galaxy, in a living universe. So the where refers to this tiny speck of an Earth in a vast living universe. Now let us put the when into some perspective. If we take the 13.8 billion years of evolution since the Big Bang as 1 year, then our species starts to walk upright 1 hour before midnight on the last day. This is equivalent to the thickness, roughly equivalent to the thickness of paint on the very top of the Empire State Building. Language begins 1.5 minutes before midnight, followed by arithmetic, painting, sculpture, architecture, and all the rest. The Buddha attains enlightenment 5.5 seconds before midnight, which is equivalent to 1.5 millennia in our normal time rate. These universal timescales are hard for our minds to grasp. Suffice it to say that, seen in this context, we, whose need we are considering, have not been around for very long. So perhaps we should not take ourselves too seriously. Nevertheless, let us now think about whose need we are indeed considering. Is it each one of us individually? Us in this room? Us in the UK? Or us humans? Or could it be the need of all of life on this earth? I shall endeavour to show that Schweitzer meant his reverence for life to concern both the first and the last of these categories, and how the fortunes of the last are intertwined with those of the first. Which brings us to part 2. As an emotional and mental attitude and an ethical philosophy, Reverence for Life was born in response to a clearly perceived need. And I could do no better than to read to you Schweitzer's own description of its birth, as recorded in his autobiography, Out of My Life and Thought. It is September 1915. Schweitzer is in Africa. War rages in Europe. As German citizens in the French colony, the Schweitzers were put under house arrest at the beginning of the war, not being allowed to work in his hospital at first. Schweitzer immediately started work on his long-standing project, the philosophy of civilization. He describes his situation, and I quote, "As I worked along, I recognized that the catastrophe of civilization stemmed from a catastrophe in our thinking. The ideals of true civilization had lost their power because the idealistic attitude towards life in which they are rooted have gradually been lost. But what is civilization? The essential element in civilization is the ethical perfection of the individual as well as society, and it comprises an ethical affirmation of the world and of life." I just interject something here. When I first began to work with all of this, having read other works by Schweitzer, I took it for granted that ethics were an ingredient of a civilized world. But I then questioned a number of people about it who denied this, and I looked it up in the dictionary, several dictionaries, and nowhere was there any mention of ethics being an ingredient of the concept of civilization. I therefore conclude, and I would be glad to be put right on this, that it is Schweitzer's original statement that ethics have to be an indispensable ingredient in the concept of civilization. I continue. In modern European thought, the tragedy is that the original bonds uniting an affirmative attitude towards the world with ethics are breaking apart. European humanity is being guided by a will to progress that has become merely external and has lost its bearings. By itself, the affirmation of life can only produce a partial and unsatisfactory civilization. Only if it turns inward can the will to progress attain the ability to distinguish the valuable from the worthless. We must therefore strive for a civilization that is not based on the accretion of science and power alone, but which cares most of all for the spiritual and ethical development of the individual and of humankind. I continue to quote, "For months on end, I lived in a continual state of mental agitation. Without the least success, I concentrated on the real nature of the affirmation of life and of ethics, and on the question of what they have in common. I was pushing at an iron door that would not yield." End of quote. So this is Schweitzer's perception of our need. to find the key that opens this door that he perceived. Then, a year later, after the beginning of the war, again allowed to travel, he is sitting on the deck of a barge going to visit a patient upstream. I continue to quote, "While in this mental state, I had to take a long journey on the river. Slowly we crept upstream, lost in thought. I sat on deck of the barge, struggling to find the elemental and universal concept of the ethical that I had not discovered in any philosophy. I covered sheet after sheet with disconnected sentences merely to concentrate on the problem. Late on the third day, there flashed upon my mind, unforeseen, unsought, the phrase, reverence for life. The iron door had yielded. The path in the thicket had become visible. I had found my way to the principle in which affirmation of the world and ethics are joined together." End of quote. I think perhaps we should recognize that at that time and during history of Western thought and Eastern religions, ethics were predominantly a negative, a not, a do not, and regarded the world as a bad place. And Schweitzer insisted that ethics be combined with affirmation of life, with a positive view of life. Except, of course, that the actual German words were Ehrfurcht vor dem Leben. And whilst Ehrfurcht was translated in the 1920s as reverence, and we are now stuck with that, the word awe is actually closer to the meaning of the German word. And to our younger generation, the word awesome would more fully convey the meaning Schweitzer intended. Namely, an attitude that experiences life as awesome and deserving of respect. Amazing, mysterious. A vision of human coexistence with one another and with nature as a whole, in which a positive and progressive attitude to life is infused with ethical values. Schweitzer then expressed the most fundamental thought, underscoring his attitude, and this has been referred to many times today. I am life that wills to live in the midst of life that wills to live. That then, in a nutshell, is what is meant by reverence for life. Schweitzer was well aware of the radical nature of his proposition. In the opening remarks of the epilogue to his autobiography, he says that if anybody wants to read just a little bit of Schweitzer's writing, I recommend the epilogue to his autobiography. He says, I am in complete disagreement with the spirit of our age, because it is filled with contempt for thought. We have come to doubt whether thinking will ever be capable of answering questions about the universe and our relationship to it in a way that would give meaning and substance to our lives. And indeed, our age has found it very hard to accept the guiding principle he has offered. But do we indeed have need of it? Which brings me to part 3. Do we now, a century after the birth of this philosophy of reverence for life, perceive our need as Schweitzer did? And how would we formulate it today? Gandhi is reported to have said, "There is a sufficiency in the world for everybody's need, but not for everybody's greed." But after years of engagement with Schweitzer's philosophy of civilization and the guidance he offered, I have come to understand that our real need lies much deeper than the physical requirements implied by this statement by Gandhi. And pondering these questions, I have come up with a few ideas, some of which I would like to try out on you. One of the many developments which have occurred since Schweitzer's time is what we call globalization, whilst he was among the first to see the huge impact of the findings of modern astronomy would have on our perception of the universe and our place within it, we now have visual information and means of global communication which he could not have dreamt of during the first half of the 20th century. So we are now in a position to think about theories of evolution in very different ways. And my thought experiments with these possibilities have led me to consider some of the well-known myths about beginnings and about the most basic thought experiences in the context of the evolution of the species. Let us look at just 5 of these. From an evolutionary viewpoint, I venture to suggest that these refer to the beginning and essence of self-consciousness. In other words, the birth of the ego, the feeling of I, which to me signifies the evolutionary step which distinguishes Homo sapiens from other mammals. Though it is obvious that domestic animals as well as advanced predators are showing signs of moving in the same direction. And as yet we are far from understanding what goes on in the brains or minds of, say, dolphins or whales or even rats. So let us consider each of these in turn from this viewpoint. Adam and Eve, and the forbidden fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. To me, the eating of this fruit signifies the awakening of a self with a conscience, resulting in a doer of good and evil deeds, and the knowledge to judge between them. That's what started there. St. John, in the beginning was the Word. This endows sound with intellectual meaning, and hence rational thought and understanding, implying a self which understands. In the beginning was the act, which is what Goethe makes his Faust pronounce. The act as opposed to happenings, implying the existence of a conscious will, the will of an actor, acting with purpose. And so we come to Descartes. I think, therefore I am. Now here the I is fully centre stage. This is the ego writ large. And this quickly takes the Western world by storm and soon becomes a global addiction, causing a deep and potentially fatal separation and isolation of educated Homo sapiens from the rest of nature. Humankind is cast in the role of a master over a diabolic nature, to be tamed and forced into servitude to answer every whim and fancy of this master. This then culminates in Nietzsche's Superman, who finds ultimate embodiment in Hitler or Stalin and others, and brings us more or less to where we are now, with the emergence of millions of little would-be supermen and women out for themselves with little regard for anyone else. I now propose that in a critical mass of global humanity, the evolution of self-consciousness, the evolution of this feeling of I, as an entity which sees itself as separate from all else, has reached a state that might be compared to the adolescence of an individual human life. Boisterous, overconfident, daring, ruthless, full of its own importance, impatient, uncompromising, but also confused by deep stirrings of inner feelings emanating from the heart, which it does not yet comprehend and which it finds difficult to manage and to integrate. Individual sages and holy men and women throughout the ages, forerunners of the evolutionary process of our species, have shown and demonstrated for millennia what maturity for a human being might be like. At the same time, our world has survived the antics of many super-egos, such as Alexander the Great, Genghis Khan, more recently Napoleon, Hitler, Stalin, to name but a few. And it will no doubt cope with whatever the USA trumps up with next. But will it survive climate change? And will it survive the stockpile of nuclear explosive material in the hands of adolescent egos? The evolution of life on Earth has survived a complete change from living off nitrogen to living off oxygen. So it may well survive the current change in climate and temperature. But will humankind survive long enough to take the evolutionary steps necessary for the ego to grow up from its boisterous adolescence to full, responsible maturity? Or will our love of speed, exploitation and explosion blow us up as a failed experiment? With his I am life that wills to live, in the midst of life that wills to live, Schweitzer leads us back into the unity of life, back to what we have in common with all living phenomena, with whom we share the same will to live. Thus the ego is reintegrated. Fully conscious of its attributes and powers, it grows up into full maturity and takes responsibility for its own well-being and that of all creatures. To take the analogy of the prodigal son, it is time for the human ego to pick itself up from the proverbial pigsty and start the journey home. But not home to an authoritarian father figure, but home to Mother Earth and her family of myriads of creatures. Thus Schweitzer describes what he calls the ethical worldview as follows. Inasmuch as ethics are an attitude for action, they are life affirmation expanded to include other lives as well as our own. However, there is more to ethics than loving devotion towards other creatures. An ethical attitude is determined by two motivations: devotion to others and inner self-improvement. It is through the longing for self-improvement that I seek to bring my life to fulfill its highest potential. Not much more. This then is the guiding principle which Schweitzer offers us. To accept it requires waking up to the longing in us for self-improvement and starting on that journey towards fulfilling our potential. To use another analogy, we call cells in our bodies which cease to cooperate with the overall function of the body as a whole cancerous. If such cells are allowed to multiply unchecked, they eventually cause the demise of their host. Seen from the standpoint of Gaia, Mother Earth as a living entity, the antics of the rebellious human ego must appear like cancerous behavior. In its self-centered, self-serving, exploitative isolation from the unity of life on Earth, with its addiction to the growth of mountains of money without the care for the common good, it seems locked in a life and death struggle with its host. But cancers have been known to be transformed, and the human ego could grow up. It is not complicated, but as always, the simplest things are the most difficult. Let your actions be guided by kindness and truthfulness towards yourself and others, with a care for the common good. In simple words, that is all it is. All that is needed for our species to play its proper part. Now the question inevitably arises as to what life would be like for a mature human race. How can it be visualized? How can we visualize its role, function, or responsibility within Mother Earth's scheme of things? What is expected of us? Reverence for Life has a simple and humble answer to this also. Its two aspects, the empathy towards all creatures and the drive towards inner self-perfection, create a harmony and beauty for all to enjoy, and sets the individual on a path towards unity with infinite being. The individual thus becomes a transformer and transmitter of subtle energies that benefit all creatures. The great thing is that in the pursuit of inner self-perfection, unlimited external growth, which is an impossibility, but which our system seems to be based on, is converted to inner growth, which by its nature is unlimited. Thus, the guiding principle of Reverence for Life combines the need of the individual with that of all of Earth's creatures, which is what I promised to demonstrate. I conclude with a little story from the East. For those of us who are in danger of being overawed by the enormity of this task. It is late at night. Ahmed, a man in a mountain village, gets a message to urgently visit a friend many miles away over treacherous terrain. It's a matter of life and death. It is pitch dark, and Ahmed only has a small lantern which casts its little light barely a few yards ahead of him. He stands in front of his house, afraid, hesitating, thinking of the long path ahead and not knowing how he will find his way. As he stands there, a wise man happens to be passing. Seeing Ahmed's hesitation, he inquires after his problem. Ahmed tells him that he has to go a long, long way and that he must start right now in the dark, but his little lamp only shines a few yards ahead. The wise man pats him on the shoulder and tells him to be of good cheer. Because the little lantern will be travelling with you, it will always be throwing light on the few yards just in front of you, enabling you to take the next few steps in safety. And before too long, the sun will rise and you will see your path clearly for a long way ahead and get to your destination in good time. And so it was. So let Reverence for Life be our lantern to guide us on our way. Thank you.